Since the 1970s and 80s, neoliberalism, championed by the UK and the United States, has been widely adopted by countries around the world and remains the world's dominant economic theory to this day. However, nearly every country that embraced it, whether large or small, has seen a period of brief prosperity followed by stagnation or even decline. And neoliberalism offers no effective solution. Normally, this would suggest that the current economic theory has major flaws and needs to be revised or replaced. This is especially true given that China, which never fully accepted neoliberalism, has enjoyed continuous, booming economic growth, creating a stark contrast with neoliberal nations. Many countries have taken notice, and a number of Western scholars have begun to criticize the doctrine. By all rights, neoliberalism should be on its way out, just as Keynesianism replaced mercantilism, and neoliberalism itself replaced Keynesianism. And yet its position remains unshakable. Even criticizing its flaws can get you branded an extremist in mainstream Western discourse. How did this situation, which runs counter to both national interest and historical patterns, come to be? For many smaller, developing nations, neoliberalism was a poison pill they were forced to swallow from the very beginning. As late developing nations, they were already technologically behind. Compounded by centuries of Western colonial exploitation, these countries had no way to accumulate the capital needed to drive development. Of the three key elements for economic growth, they were critically deficient in at least two. Even if these nations poured all their resources into funding some research and developing new technologies, the products they created could hardly compete on the international market against those from advanced economies. In this situation, the only way for these nations to develop was to borrow money and attract foreign investment. Even a large nation like China, which places a premium on self-reliance, could not avoid this reality. But the only ones with money to lend were the same developed nations that got rich from colonial plunder and subscribed to a deep-seated belief in the law of the jungle. Even the seemingly benevolent International Monetary Fund, IMF, which claims to help developing countries, is in fact controlled by the US and Europe. These Western powers were forced to give up their colonies by a wave of nationalism and were never truly willing to help their former subjects develop into independent, prosperous nations. The real reason the West was willing to lend money was to make even more money while simultaneously regaining control over these nations' economic lifelines by controlling their economic lifelines. At the time, during the Cold War, the West couldn't be too overt about its greed, as this would push the Third World toward the socialist bloc. This is where neoliberalism, with its zealous promotion of privatization and free markets, and its rejection of state intervention and protectionism, entered the picture. After all, in a purely competitive market, developing nations could never be a match for the West. This framework allowed the West to engage in exploitation in a way that appeared fair, legal, and legitimate. Initially, the West was somewhat wary that unchecked free markets could trigger economic crises. But when the stagflation of the 1970s hit, a crisis Keynesianism was powerless to solve, they threw caution to the wind. Their new thinking was, if economic crises are inevitable anyway, why not go all in and maximize profits from international competition? And so, in the late 1970s and early 80s, the two standard-bearers of capitalism led the charge into the arms of neoliberalism, promoting the theory across the globe. Any country that wanted a loan from the IMF had to accept neoliberal doctrine, full privatization, and a complete opening of its markets. Developing nations knew the risks, but if they wanted the money, they had to accept the terms. The weaker and more desperate a country was, the less room it had to bargain. The consequence of accepting neoliberalism was that the few local industries these nations had managed to build were either crushed by mature Western products or swallowed up by Western capital. Even if a flood of foreign investment brought a period of prosperity, the West, especially the United States, could siphon off those development gains whenever it needed to. Neoliberalism brought catastrophic results to smaller nations, robbing them of any chance at sustainable development. But the developed nations of the West did not escape unscathed. To be sure, in the privatized, market-driven environment championed by neoliberalism, these countries could leverage their dominant position to harvest the fruits of labor from less developed nations, trapping them on the periphery of the global economic system. But neoliberal theory isn't just for export. It applies at home, too. While plundering other nations, the West was forced to swallow the bitter medicine itself. As the power of state intervention weakened, a feeding frenzy of corporate mergers and acquisitions, the big fish eating the small fish, began to play out in the US and Europe. The small and medium-sized businesses that once provided a vast number of jobs and generated wealth were gradually driven into bankruptcy by massive multinational corporations. Monopolies formed. It has been well established since the late 19th and early 20th centuries that monopolies destroy market price mechanisms, stifle innovation, and exacerbate social inequality. This process was accelerated by globalization. In pursuit of greater profits, multinational corporations began moving their supply chains to regions with cheaper raw materials and labor. This led to the disappearance of manufacturing jobs in the West. This was a critical blow, as manufacturing jobs generally require higher skill levels, pay better wages, and are more stable than service sector jobs. The strong middle class of the mid-20th century in Europe and America
was built on the back of a powerful domestic manufacturing sector. In a sense, these multinational corporations were destroying their own country's foundations. But capital does not forsake profit for patriotism. And under the guidance of neoliberalism, Western governments had voluntarily given up their power to intervene directly, leaving them with only the weak tools of fiscal and monetary policy. These instruments were far too feeble to stop the corporate exodus. As a result, the very nations that had ridden industrialization to become developed began a process of deindustrialization, partly by choice, partly by force. At first, the West wasn't concerned. Confident in their scientific and technological superiority, they believed they would always control the core parts of production. That is, until China, which had absorbed the global manufacturing shift, began to innovate on that industrial base, gradually catching up to and even surpassing the West in many areas. Then, after the 2008 financial crisis, social tensions in the West boiled over, and they finally began to sense that something was terribly wrong. To maintain their position, Western nations attempted to suppress China, but this only made them feel the full, painful consequences of their own industrial hollowing out. Their technological monopoly, which they thought was their ace in the hole, could only slow China's progress, and, ironically, even spurred China's drive for self-sufficiency. But China's monopoly on production capacity could hit the West's soft underbelly. Now, even when China touches upon their core interests, they dare not resort to their traditional military threats because their domestic military-industrial capacity can no longer support a large-scale war against a manufacturing superpower like China. After decades adrift in a delusion of superiority, the West had a rude awakening. They were not invincible. Some Western scholars began to criticize the flaws of neoliberalism, but these rational voices could never seem to break into the mainstream discourse. The West continues to march to the beat of neoliberalism, moving ever further down the path of deregulation and corporate empowerment. This situation is actually quite abnormal. Economic theory is ultimately meant to serve the national interest. Typically, when a country's reigning ideology fails to support its development, it seeks a new one. And while economic research may seem independent, it relies on state support. When a government favors a certain theory, research in that field gets more funding, its academics find it easier to advance, more people are drawn to the field, and more research is produced. If small countries continue to follow neoliberalism after being burned by it, one could argue it's because they are being coerced by larger powers. But when the Western powers themselves are suffering, and even their own academic world is beginning to turn against it, what is preventing a change in economic theory?
The question seems puzzling, but the answer is simple. You just have to ask, who benefits? Yes, the nations that embraced neoliberalism ultimately suffered, but there is one group that profited handsomely: multinational capital. While capitalists may have a homeland, capital does not. And it's naive to expect patriotism from those who control it. For capital, the weaker the state, the fewer the constraints, and the greater the profits. From its perspective, this is a good thing. As for whether neoliberalism destabilizes nations, harms their development, or limits humanity's future, capital could not care less. In fact, it would prefer the world to remain permanently stratified, making its own position even more secure. In the capitalist countries of the West, capital can easily control the government. After all, politicians depend on its support. So even though the devastating flaws of neoliberalism are on full display, the West is forced to keep championing it. In fact, the grand plan of multinational capital was on the verge of complete success. If it weren't for one country, China, that withstood the pressure and temptation and insisted on the government's role in regulating the economy, the world would be at the mercy of capital running rampant. It is precisely because of the principles China upheld that it has become the world's engine of growth in recent years, catching up to and even surpassing traditional developed nations in numerous industries and prompting a period of deep soul-searching in the West. But capital will not sacrifice short-term profits for the good of the nation. Even though the West has recognized the problem, under the influence of capital, it is destined to remain paralyzed. For any of this to change, there are only two possibilities. Either the West undergoes a revolution, or change will only come when China's continued rise becomes so significant that it fundamentally reshapes the global order.